Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was recorded at Acton University, our flagship conference. Acton University is a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Each day is filled with thought-provoking presentations on the intellectual and practical foundations of a free society. At Acton University, you can sharpen your intellect, expand your worldview, and learn the foundations of genuine human flourishing. To learn more, visit university.acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Stephanie Slade. Stephanie is senior editor at Reason Magazine and a fellow in liberal studies at the Acton Institute. Is politics a war of all against all? Should it be? Henry Adams back in the 19th century said politics was the systematic organization of hatreds. How should Christians respond to the state of affairs? And is there a more constructive and loving way forward? Stephanie, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you've been writing a lot about right-wing movements in the United States, particularly the sort of new right. You've been writing about them in terms of policies and proposals and evaluating those from a sort of classical fusionist perspective. But you've also been writing about sort of the tone and timing of this sort of movement. Could you describe for the listeners, sort of orient them first, like who are we talking about, and how are those folks talking, and what about it is unsettling?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a little bit of a complicated question. We're at a moment right now where the conservative movement, or the American right, is very much in flux, right? And there's a lot of different factions that are sort of competing to determine what the future of the movement is going to look like, and what are the principles that we stand for, and what do we believe and why. And so the old-fashioned sort of Reaganite, what I call fusionist, conservative, consensus was liberty and virtue is what it means to be a conservative in the American context. But now we have this new right, or they sometimes will call themselves the dissident right, which are people who say, like, that consensus did not get us to outcomes that we like, and so we are no longer going to be thinking in terms of liberty and virtue or Reagan-esque kind of policies, but rather we want to embrace a muscular government that we wield as a tool or even a weapon against our enemies to try to bring society around to where we think it should be. And so that's the main distinction, I think, between sort of old school, classically liberal conservatives and conservative-ish libertarians like me, and the new right or the dissident right that are much more in favor of a muscular politics, a muscular use of government power. And so I think that is the main distinction, but it shows up in various ways. I mean, you could, in theory, be a person who's just sort of a wonky technocrat who says, I want to use the government to try to make the world a better place, but not talk about politics as war and enmity. Yeah. However, a lot of people on this new right have explicitly embraced the idea that politics is war, that politics is about understanding who your friends are and who your enemies are, and using the power of the state, not just to make the world a better place, but to reward your friends and to punish your enemies. And that, I think, is a really big departure from really the American approach to politics, left, right, or center from the last century, for example.
Yeah, it's a very confrontational sort of framing. And it's a notion that, like, a failure to make progress on certain issues is the result of a failure of will. And you've also talked about this as a will to power conservatism. What do you make of that sort of just judgment in general? Like, are they right? Has the conservative movement failed to deliver? And if they are right, what should be our takeaway from that? Their takeaway from that is you need to sort of double down on a more assertive, aggressive posture. What's the alternative to that?
it's like a yes and situation, right? There are many things that folks on the new right or the dissident right would say have been failures of the conservative movement or the Republican Party that I would say, yeah, you have a point there, right? So to sort of make the strongest case that I can on their behalf for them, they would say something like, over the last century, the far left has made a long march through the institutions, and they now control the higher education system, all of our elite universities, Hollywood, the mainstream media, and much of the federal bureaucracy are all held by, in the hands of the left, and they're using all of these different institutions to impose leftist values and norms on society, whether people like it or not. And so there's no way to respond to that situation other than rethinking, because what they would say is like the conservative movement and the Republican Party allowed that to happen. They failed to stop that long march to the institutions, and so now we've lost the commanding heights of society, and we have to fight to get them back. That's sort of the new right, I think, approach to this. I think there's some truth to this, that it is certainly the case that many, many, many important, influential cultural institutions in society, in our country, in our society, are in the hands of the left, that they have worked really hard, for example, to populate the schools that train future teachers, so that then the teachers go into the public schools and they teach the next generation of young people a sort of left-skewed understanding of American history. This is a reasonable critique that we can make. But I think that there's also many ways in which this critique is often dramatically exaggerated in the service of making this case that we must throw out the rules and blow it all up and seize control of power. So I mean, just to have a little bit of perspective, okay, there are plenty of Christian and conservative, more conservative-oriented universities and colleges out there. There is also a resurgence or sort of renaissance happening right now of classical schooling and school choice at the state level happening, giving parents and families many more choices. There are all kinds. I mean, although the mainstream media may have a strong left bias, and I'm not going to say that that's not true, there's also alternatives out there, including the most watched cable news channel is the conservative news channel. The most popular podcasters are conservative or at least not left-wing podcasters, right? There are magazines, there are websites, there are plenty of sources to go and get alternative perspectives. It's not as though we live in a world where there are 3 channels and everybody's getting their news from the same place, and those channels are held in the hands of the left, and therefore people who are conservative have no opportunity to hear their perspective aired. That's just not the world we live in at all. And so there's plenty of ways in which market competition is actually happening the way you would expect it to, the way you would want it to, where there are new solutions sort of emerging all the time to try to counteract these problems. There's some evidence that the decline in church attendance that we've seen for decades is starting to, level out and maybe reverse itself among the next generation. So I think that it is very possible and that the new right tends to be guilty of like dramatically overstating how bad things are and they have to do that. They absolutely have to say that the situation is desperate and extreme because the way that they want to use power is so extreme. And the only way you could possibly justify that is if like, this is it. These are existential stakes. If we do not win the next political battle, it's all over for us. They're going to throw us in a gulag. And I just don't think that's where we are.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of policy victories at both sort of the national and the state level that have been really enduring. One of them is just sort of like persistently lower federal tax rates than we had prior to the sort of Reagan Revolution, which was the sort of triumph of movement conservatism in the Republican Party. Another is the Dobbs decision. The reversal of Roe versus Wade was very much an accomplishment of the sort of old school conservative legal movement. You have gun rights on the state level that are much more expansive than they were in the sort of post-war world where the American conservative movement...
Affirmative action being rolled back, sort of the power of the administrative state, the discretionary power of the administrative state kind of being rethought because of the successes, as you say, of the conservative legal movement. So yes, totally. This is not a moment where we're teetering on the edge of the abyss. I really think that we have a fairly... Our politics are not maybe as healthy as they could be, but they're not so broken that there's nothing left to be salvaged, I think.
Yeah. So this rhetoric, you've started, I think, you've been writing about this for 3 or 4 years
at least,
now.
Yeah.
Has it gotten better or worse? Because in that time, we now have a second Trump administration. Many of these people have gotten to see a more assertive expression of sort of right-wing politics now. Has that ameliorated this rhetoric at all? Has it fueled it? Where do you see, is it the same? Has there been any change with the huge amount of change we've had in American politics over these last 3-4 years?
Yeah, so somewhat that's to be determined. Like, we're still in the early days, relatively speaking, of the second Trump administration. Some of the people who have been on the forefront of pushing this sort of very militant rhetoric of the new right are now in the administration, right?
Yeah.
So Michael Anton, for example, he worked at Hillsdale College and he's been affiliated with the Claremont Review of Books. He wrote the famous essay back in 2016, The Flight 93 Election, where he basically was saying that Republicans or conservatives must vote for Donald Trump, because it was like being on Flight 93 on 9/11, where you charge the cockpit or you die. And he was arguing, if Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, we will die. Like, it is over for all the things that we hold dear. And so, although Donald Trump, voting for Donald Trump is a gamble because you don't know what you're going to get with somebody who's untested like that, we got to do it anyway. It's like charging the cockpit and taking our chances. We will definitely die if we don't. That was his argument. That's just like straight out of Game of Thrones, right? When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. So he was one of the early voices making this very extreme apocalyptic argument for why conservatives must be willing to embrace the most extreme response to the left. He is now, and he went into the first Trump administration, and he's now working in the second Trump administration. So the idea that things are so incredibly hopeless for conservatives or Republicans or people on the right of center, I think is belied by actual reality over the course of this time. Because in 2021 or so, he went on a podcast and said something like, at this point, Trump had been impeached twice. January 6th happens. Biden wins. Biden is now back in power. And he says, I don't think they're ever going to let a Republican win another national election again, right? They've so consolidated their power in the wake of all this that will never happen again. It's all over for us. Well, Trump wins 3 years later, and Anton is back at the White House, right? So it's not nearly as serious as it looks, I think, sometimes in the moment. And so it's hard to say, like, is that going to cause him to rethink some things? Or these guys that were reading him and taking their cues from people like Michael Anton, are they going to rethink some things now based on the way that reality has played out? I don't know. I hope so. We're not necessarily hearing from all of them in the same way, because when the Democrats are in power, these guys are mostly influencers. They're podcasters. They're writing blog posts, right? You're hearing they're trying to shape the conversation. When their side is in power and they're working in these positions of power, you're not necessarily hearing from them the same way because they're actually doing the work.
Yeah. So you have been on a lot of panels, a lot of discussions with these folks about these sort of issues. You live in Washington, D.C., so you get to know these folks on like a personal basis, because it's one thing to sort of read these things or to hear these things on a podcast. It's another thing to like actually have a dialogue and a conversation with somebody. Where do you think they're coming from on a personal level? It could be, I mean, is it a sort of cynical, populist, anti-elite rhetoric is one way it could be. Are they sincere believers in that, in this sort of apocalyptic framing of politics? Or is it something in between where it's kind of like, yes, they believe the core of it is there, but they also believe, politics involves a little bit of theater, and you bring a little spice to get some attention in sort of a media-saturated age?
It's a great question. One of the reasons it's hard to answer is because although we often use new right or dissident right as an umbrella term, there actually are a bunch of different factions under there. So I'm writing a lot about this, and I talk about how there are folks who identify as more like post-liberal, they're more religious, socially conservative. Their critiques of the status quo have to do with the fact that, like, again, religiosity has fallen off. People aren't getting married and having kids or as many kids. Sort of the Christian values or Judeo-Christian morality increasingly seems to be absent from our society. We've gone off the rails in those ways. That's a different faction from, for example, the neo-reactionaries, the Curtis Yarvins and the Bronze Age perverts. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, like, good for you. I'm a little bit envious that you don't. But so there's some of these bloggers, Nick Fuentes, bloggers and YouTubers and podcasters who are pushing something that is a lot darker and a lot more they would say realist, right? They would say politics is war, and all that matters is that we have power and we use it against our enemies, and that they're being very straightforward about the strong and the worthy ought to be the rulers, and the other people ought to, accept being ruled by their betters. That is a different kind of approach to politics, even than the more theoconish, post-liberal, right? One that's I think a lot of people really say, like, I care about the common good. I feel like society is not where I want it to be. I want to figure out how to make it better. So some people, it really just depends on the person and who you're talking about. And there's probably a little bit of all these things. Some people are true believers that things have gone so far awry that all we can do is tear it down and start from scratch. And other people are just trying to figure out how can we whip up the base into fear and fury so that they'll vote the way we want them to vote, so that we can come to power, which is our ultimate goal. It really depends. And I always try hard not to ascribe like the worst possible intentions to people, but there definitely is some of all of this going on.
Mm-hmm. So let's bracket off the folks who, the strong do what they can and the weak endure what they must. Let's bracket those folks off. There's a certain amount of sort of antisocial folks in any population, or provocateurs, but there are a lot of sincere religious believers, people who would have very comfortably fit a generation ago in a more mainstream conservative movement, who by this argument that is the sort of dissident right or the new right or whatever you want to call it is making, or if they don't buy the argument, at least there's something to it. They feel resentful because the country's not where they think it should be, and they feel put upon and they feel marginalized. And a lot of times, that's because they are put upon and they are marginalized and they are devalued and dismissed by sort of secular media and academia. So you have these sincere religious believers of a lot of different traditions. What do you make of those folks in bracket off those when you see this in terms of folks, we're both Roman Catholic, but, we both have evangelical friends as well. We both know people of many religious traditions. What do you see people that you're their sort of religiosity is, if not my tradition, a lot like my tradition. They seem to have the sort of concerns that I have. They're not these sort of, Nietzschean Ubermensch type figures. They're just normal moms and dads or young people who are at universities, and they feel like progressive narratives are kind of thrown in their face 24/7, and they just feel really, really alienated from their communities. And they see this as a way of sort of making some space for them to sort of, authentically live out their religious convictions. What do you see with those folks in particular? How much buy-in do you see from folks like that? How much, if they're not buy-in, just curiosity? And then on the other hand, do you see folks in that situation that see this and they're kind of and how does that break down in what you've seen?
I don't have a lot of data to tell you how exactly it breaks down. I'll say after the 2020 election, the Ethics and Public Policy Center did a survey of people who voted for Donald Trump in 2020. And what I thought was so interesting about the results of that survey was that there was not universal agreement on hardly any policy issues, even stuff that Donald Trump ran on, like immigration and trade. There was a wide variety of perspectives. People were, in many cases, the Trump voters were divided on something like, is trade good or bad for America? But where there was almost universal agreement, like 90% agreement at least, was on questions about feeling culturally under siege in our own country, right? Stuff like Christianity is under attack in America today. 90% of people who vote for Donald Trump agree with that statement. And they're not entirely imagining it, right? I started out actually in my early years at Reason Magazine, my beat was writing about religious liberty and religious liberty controversies. I started at Reason during the tail end of the Obama years. And there were plenty of legitimate examples of the federal government and of state governments going after people of faith and trying to infringing on their First Amendment rights, right? So thinking during the Obama years of the HHS contraception mandate, trying to essentially forced Catholic nuns to pay for birth control and abortifacient drugs for their employees. More recently, you see stuff like the gay cake controversies, where the state of Colorado was trying to force a Christian baker to bake cakes decorated in a way to celebrate a gay marriage. And he says, I don't want to do that. I don't want to use my artistic my abilities to create something that celebrates gay marriage when I don't believe in gay marriage. And the state of Colorado has been repeatedly going after him to try to force him to do that. I've written a lot about the ACLU. ACLU has been great on many things over the years, but in the last decade, it has launched one lawsuit after another against religious hospitals, Catholic and Protestant hospitals, to force them to perform abortions and gender transition surgeries for self-identified trans people, and elective sterilization procedures. And especially in Catholic hospitals, that is just not going to fly. A Catholic hospital is not going to do elective abortions and elective sterilization procedures, but the ACLU is going to take them to court repeatedly, trying to force them to do it and making them spend money defending their First Amendment rights, their clear First Amendment right to not be involved in those things. So when Christians or when people of faith say we feel under assault in our country, we feel like the left is willing to use the state power against us and is trying to force us to live according to their values, why shouldn't we fight back? Why shouldn't we maybe even try to seize that power and turn it against them? Wouldn't it feel good to do to them what they've been doing to us? I can understand where they're coming from. I can understand that, and I don't want to be dismissive of it, even if I do think that sometimes the seriousness of the threat can be blown out of proportion by opportunistic, online influencers. So, for example, I think that these ACLU lawsuits against Catholic hospitals are horrible. I've written a lot about how immoral and unconstitutional they are. The good news is that the courts have consistently sided with the Catholic hospitals, right? Yeah. The ACLU is trying their best to force these hospitals to perform these procedures that they consider to be immoral, the taking of innocent human life. But the courts recognize that the First Amendment is the First Amendment. The Constitution is the Constitution. This is a free country, and hospitals are not going to be forced to do those things. And so our system sort of is working in many cases. The bulwarks of our liberal institutions are doing their job to stave off the worst excesses, the worst attempts to enforce or impose leftist ideology on everyone in this militant way in many cases. So I want to both give credit and have empathy for people who feel this sense of being under assault, but also put it in perspective and say it's bad, it's maybe not that bad. And the good news, the other piece of good news is that although there is this sort of siege mentality, this feeling among people of faith and conservatives that something has gone wrong, and we feel like we're being told that we're not even welcome in our own country, like the culture in America is not even is hostile to people like us, that's not a great situation to be in. Ultimately, when you poll Americans, generally speaking, the vast majority of people, left or right, center left, center right, most people do believe very deeply in freedom and limited government and individual rights. They do not want to seize the power of the state and wield it against their enemies in that way. They don't see people who disagree with them politically as their enemies. That's actually a very much a niche elite view, to see somebody who disagrees with you on politics as an enemy to be destroyed. Most Americans don't feel that way. That is a thing that we do have data that backs up. I worry that is eroding over time. The more the siege mentality sets in, the more you feel like you're under assault, the less likely you are to see your political opponent as just an opponent and potentially a friend, and the more likely you are to see them as an enemy to be destroyed. So I do worry that we're trending in the wrong direction, but we're not there yet.
I think that's a great observation, that a lot of times this sort of resentment and animosity is elite fueled, and I think part of it is a product of folks being in these institutions that are more like ideologically siloed, and all of a sudden they don't have a professional life where they're mixing with the great body of Americans who may believe very different things to them. It's almost these institutions become victims of their own success, and you can have a career, a professional career. All your social networks can be embedded in a sort of political tribe in America and not have a lot of engagement with folks outside of that. Is this more pronounced in some religious traditions than others? So traditionally, if you go back to like Father Richard John Newhouse and Catholics and evangelicals together, There was sort of like a religious right that was primarily Protestant driven before that, but there was a sort of growing consensus of people from a variety of religious traditions around sort of socially conservative issues. And they seem to be coming together in sort of a shared conception of the common good, what bringing religion into the public square in a really healthy way would look like. Does that still hold, or are there more pronounced sectarian differences that are emerging as the rhetoric is changing?
It's a great question. I don't actually know for sure the answer to it. I think that there's a lot of currents going on. There's a lot of things going on right now. Again, there's a lot of ferment in our politics at this moment. And so you go to something like the National Conservatism Conference. You and I have both attended that in past years, and I plan to go again this year. And you see a strong Protestant ethos driving a lot of that. Even Yoram Hazony, who is the organizer of that conference and who is himself Israeli Jew, thinks that America is a Protestant country and that should be maintained. That anything that were to change the texture of American culture by bringing too many people in who are not European Protestants would be a mistake, because America was founded as a Protestant country. And so there's definitely that piece of this, is a sense that like America was founded to be a white, Christian, Protestant, European descended nation. And so we need to be very cautious about a lot of immigration or even open trade with other countries, because it could dilute in some way the cultural fabric of our country. There's that going on. There's also the rise of Catholic integralism, or the resurgence of Catholic integralism in recent years, or what the word that actually has been used more recently was post-liberal. This is mostly Roman Catholics who think that the separation of church and state was a mistake in some sense, and that the state and the church need to be better integrated. That's sort of where integralism comes from, and that the church should have a say over the sort of civil authority and the exercise of civil power in some sense, in order to, again, enforce Judeo-Christian morality and reorient society to the common good. That's a thing that's going on. And in some cases, the people in these different parts of the movement are talking to each other and are speaking at each other's conferences and things, writing for each other's blogs. But there's a lot of things going on, and it's hard to guess how it's all going to shake out in the end, because we're living through it in real time.
Yeah. So there's policy differences, there's sort of religious differences. How is this something that as you've observed it and watched it develop, do you find roots to this? Maybe not in this full-fledged dominant force, but if you look back, is this something that grew up within the conservative movement, and or is it something that sort of entered the water from the outside in some ways?
Definitely, there has been an element of this that's always been there. The sort of anti-classical liberal conservatism has always been there. I'm thinking back to in the 1950s and 1960s, you had this great debate between Frank Meyer and Brent Bozell. Now, these are names that have been somewhat lost to history a little bit. Neither of them are so famous in our politics today the way like a Milton Friedman is. But Frank Meyer was a believer in sort of fusionist Reagan-style, classically liberal conservatism, and Brent Bozell was more of an early Catholic integralist who thought that there needed to be more of an integration between church and state, that we needed to have the government passing laws in a sort of muscular fashion to make America be a Christian country. And they would write these dueling essays back and forth in the pages of National Review magazine, right? So there always was an element of this debate there. However, I think that it was it's fairly uncontroversial to say that in the 20th century, the Frank Meyer fusionist, classically liberal Reaganite side won that debate. It was always the overwhelming consensus within the movement was that this is America. This is not, we're not Europe. We don't have that background of throne and altar conservatism. Our conservatism here is about conserving the institutions and the norms and the principles of the American founding, which are in a sense liberal, right? So our conservatives in America are also liberals in this very interesting and unique way, and that's a really important part of the character of the American sort of spirit that we're trying to conserve and preserve and protect. That view, I think, is very deeply rooted in this country and in the conservative movement here, and so it has been, and it still continues to be a really important part of the conservative movement. So the New Right is new in that it is a breaking from or dissenting from that consensus, and it's having more success than we saw that view, I think, have in the past, in the last century, for example. That's what makes it new and different. But I don't think that it's by any means like has taken over the conservative movement and American conservatism is now fully post-liberal or something. I think there's a really interesting live debate happening right now between the factions who still have that deeply rooted sense of like, we want to preserve the values of the American founding, the principles of individual liberty and limited government and rule of law and free markets and free people, that's still a really pervasive part of what it means to be a conservative. I actually have an anecdote for this.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I attended an anniversary celebration of the Heritage Foundation. The Conservative Heritage Foundation was having, I think it was their 50th anniversary. And I was sitting next to a woman and her 22-year-old son. They came from Georgia, and they worked in real estate, and it was like 3 generations of this family had been longtime supporters of Heritage. And I was chatting with them about the current state of American politics, and the son said to me at one point, I love that the Republican Party, we're the working class party now. He was very proud of this. Like, this is a change that's been undergone, that the Republican Party has undergone. And it's true. It's borne out in, for example, a share of working class vote that Donald Trump got over the last 2 election cycles has consistently increased. So the Republican Party is becoming more of a working class party. And so I asked this young man, that's interesting that you say that. Do you think that being a working class party means that the party needs to rethink some of its historical commitments to free markets and free trade? And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, no, we're conservatives. We believe in freedom. So I think that was a really telling moment for me.
Yeah. And you have these folks, even these folks who are more hostile to markets and freedom. I think of like Michael Lind is a great example. He tries to root those critiques of markets in what? An appeal to the founding, in an appeal to the same sources. He'll go back and he'll say, well, Alexander Hamilton was in favor of tariffs. All of this history is much more complicated than Michael Lind paints it. But it's encouraging that is still a sort of bedrock tradition that people are seeking to return to.
Though there are also then dissenters on that as well. So some figures within the New Right will basically say that yes, the American founding was liberal, and that's why it was evil and corrupt to begin with, and why we shouldn't be defending the liberalism of the American founding. We should be rejecting it and replacing it with a new Christian founding. So you do hear people making that argument as well. I think they have actually a much harder, for this reason, right? Yeah. They have a much harder case to make because most Americans even conservatives, even people of faith, they just don't believe that about the country that they were born into and the traditions that they've inherited.
Yeah. How do you respond to this constructively? I mean, I think you modeled part of it in the anecdote, was that you ask questions. Because I think a lot of this is more surface level and rhetorical. And that if you actually, with a lot of people, if you actually sort of have a conversation, you realize, oh, they've sort of adapted this rhetoric, but sort of like beneath the surface of it, there's actually a lot of common ground still. Even despite the fact that you get very strident rhetoric from some folks. What are some other ways, in addition to just asking questions and listening and trying to understand, which is kind of what we've done so far in this conversation, is just try to get a handle on like, what is this? Are these grievances legitimate? Do we think? I guess the first question is, if we don't think that their appeal to a more assertive rhetoric and a more muscular state,
what's the alternative?
Is the answer, how do you address their concerns and respond to them in also a religiously informed way? Because I notice, at least among the more religious members of this, a lot of them see this more assertive rhetoric and these arguments for a more muscular state. They try to reduce. They try to trace this historically into, let's say, their magisterial Protestant traditions that have historically had a religious establishment. Now, many of those expressions in the United States, like Presbyterians in here, Presbyterians modified their confessions in 1789 to remove arguments supporting church establishment. Abraham Kuyper led an effort in the Netherlands to modify the Belgic Confession to remove those aspects supporting state establishment there. So, but there is an earlier tradition in that sort of Presbyterian and Reformed tradition that's more establishmentarian, more hostile to freedom in this robust sense. There is a very mixed history in the Roman Catholic Church, as both of us know, in terms of religious freedom, in terms of how do we contextualize the church's social teaching? Is it antagonistic to markets? Is it affirming of markets? How do we engage on sort of all those levels? Because they have questions of political expediency, and then they also have appeals to sort of like rival traditions as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a moment for going back to first principles, and I think that has been lost a little bit over time. This is probably a natural thing that happens in any political movement, but you start out debating ideas and thinking deeply about philosophy, but eventually you start getting itchy to start wanting to implement that in the political realm, right? Mm-hmm. Win elections and get policies enacted or whatever, and you sort of shift your attention away from debating ideas and passing on a good solid intellectual founding to the next generation, and you're starting to just figure out, how do we win elections? How can we get the voting base on our side so that we can be the ones who win the next election? I think that happened in the conservative movement over the last 40 or 60 years, and so a lot of the philosophical grounding has been lost. Young conservatives today don't realize that these debates were actually already happened once between Frank Meyer and Brent Bozell, for example. They think they're the first people who have ever noticed that there's such a thing as the common good, and that we have to grapple with these difficult questions about how to incorporate the common good into our political thinking, right? So I really feel like although winning elections matters and getting good policies enacted matters, because it affects how the people's material prosperity are dependent upon the kinds of laws and regulations that get passed. Right now is a moment for going back to talking and thinking and writing and thinking deeply and debating, really, really rigorously about what are the principles? What do we believe? Why do we believe them? And going back and recovering some of this history. So I wrote a piece a couple years ago. It was a response to Yuval Levin at AEI. And I wrote about how, yes, it's true that actually in the early days of the United States, we didn't have a prohibition on established churches at the state level. The First Amendment said you couldn't have a national church, but states were allowed to have churches, and colonies before the Revolution did have established churches in many cases.
Yeah.
However, the history also shows that through the experience of experimenting with having these established churches, over time, every single state voluntarily disestablished, right? And they eliminated the practice of collecting tax dollars to fund churches in this country, which is a thing that's still done in Europe, in many parts of Europe. It's not done here. That was a choice. It was not imposed upon them from the top down. Through experience, they realized, this isn't actually going the way we want. It's not producing the outcomes we want. We think actually religion flourishes better in a free society and where it's voluntarily funded, for example. And so through trial and error and through experience, these best practices and these beliefs and principles evolved and developed and matured. And that has happened also with Catholic Church's understanding of concepts around religious liberty, for example. And I don't know the Protestant theological history as well, but I think that there's evidence of that too. And so, yes, we shouldn't be denying that the history is complicated. We should be engaging with that complicated history and not being afraid of the complicated and difficult conversations that might entail, because that's how you do the difficult intellectual work of having a really solid foundation that's sort of underneath the political movement that then is going to go try to convert those principles into an actual political program and get people elected.
One of the things that I really worry about when I go to these, like the National Conservatism Conference, when I go to these conferences, I hear these speeches, when I read these magazine articles, when I, read these books, is I see sometimes the appropriation of religion, I think, in a sort of cynical way. That it is, I have a hostility to the liberal order for whatever reasons. Some of them very legitimate. You know, we've talked about some of the problems we have in the United States with finding space for people of faith in public life and sometimes even in private life, in private business, as you've enumerated. Like there are very real challenges, but I feel a lot of times folks are frustrated with that, and then they seek to go back and cherry pick the historical record, and so you'll get Roman Catholics that will appeal to encyclicals prior to Rerum Novarum or prior to the Second Vatican Council's statements, and they'll seek to read traditions selectively and to not actually. It's a sort of anachronistic religion that seems to be constructed more to sort of create an argument of authority for a political argument than it is sort of like a genuine engagement in a real living tradition. What do you make of that? I know you probably can't speak too much beyond sort of the realms of what you see in Catholicism, but I've read enough Protestant scholasticism from my work at Acton to know that like a lot of this stuff is cherry picked and it's selective. And I know that, you've done a lot of work on Catholic social teaching. And also I'm sure this stuff, that you see from some post-liberal Roman Catholic folks is again, very cherry picking and selective. How do you counter that? Where religion seems to be like reduced to an ideology, and it becomes a sort of instrumental tool to sort of create and mobilize a political community.
Yeah. I mean, the first and most important thing is to try to be on guard to not fall victim to that ourselves, right? Because I have no doubt that this actually happens among people on our side of the debate as well. The cherry picking, the ignoring the inconvenient history, right? Not reading the encyclicals, skipping over certain encyclicals because it's inconvenient, something like that. So we want to engage honestly. We want to engage deeply. We want to recognize that this is not going to be black and white, and it's not going to be just a super simple narrative with clean lines around good guys and bad guys and that sort of thing. And I think that young people especially actually are hungry for that deeper engagement with ideas and the complexity of life in a way that is actually made it so that the new right, these guys who seem to be engaging with the older texts, for example, resurrecting pre-Vatican II encyclicals. This seems exciting and interesting, and like there's some deeper grounding to their thinking. And if we're not there with them, reading those same things and engaging on the history and the theology in a deep way, then we're going to lose the next generation of young Catholics or young people who are hungry for this engagement with ideas, this deep engagement with ideas. So that's the main thing. Is not. Yes, I think there is a lot of cherry picking and opportunistic, using religion in an opportunistic political way. But there's also, I think, a hunger for people who want to engage with these texts and these ideas in a deep way. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that also. And of course, Acton does a huge amount of this. But the conservative movement as a whole, I think, has gotten out of the habit of being principle first, ideas first, philosophy first, and become much more of a political organ over the last few decades. And I think that that's kind of opened up the opportunity for the new right, at least certain parts of the new right, to hold themselves out as the place where young people who want to engage deeply with ideas and theology and stuff go. And we can't allow that to be the case, that's the only option for them.
Stephen Miller at the last National Conservatism Convention gave a very sort of illuminating speech for me, sitting in the audience last at NatCon 4. He said that part of the sort of political project is engaging the passions, and that actually like complicating these things paralyzes people. It renders them unable to act. So what you've really got to do is you can't appeal to people's reason. You need to appeal to people's passions in order to get them to the ballot box. And that's the way that change happens in the world. And you have to engage those passions. You've given a very different vision of what sort of constructive engagement with civil society, public life is. And it's a thinking first sort of orientation. What do you say to those critics that say, like, I mean, and we see this in our lives all the time. You know, David Hume, you know, famously thought all of our reason is in fact a sort of form of rationalization of our passions. Like, that's the way we do it. And we all, you know, and we see this in our own lives. Sometimes we talk ourselves into things because actually it's just what we want to do, and like our reasons are post hoc. How do you, as somebody who like reads and thinks for a living, like you're very invested in this, how does that, how has it changed you? How has it made you, how do you think it has made you better able to engage as an individual? And is that scalable? Is there, where's your hope for engaging the broad populace on this level? How do you think through that yourself?
We're never going to get, you know, all American voters to sit down and do a book study with Rerum Novarum, right? So that is actually not a realistic plan forward. But I think back to 1947 when Friedrich Hayek, the future Nobel-winning economist, founded the Mont Pelerin Society. He was bringing together scholars from around the world who were very concerned about the rise of both fascism and communism, but basically unfree societies around the world. And he was bringing people together to say, how do we as scholars who believe in freedom and the free society promote freedom? How do we promote and defend the free world against these threats? And what he said was, it starts with small groups of essentially intellectual elites, thought leaders, getting together in a room and thinking hard and doing academic discussions where we get clear about what truth is, right? And he argued, if we're trying to affect politics today, we're getting the order of operations wrong, because ultimately the sort of intellectual ideas that come out of conversations like those at the Mont Pelerin Society are the ones that will, a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades from now, determine what the ideas are in the bloodstream of the society, and that their voters are imbibing without sitting down and doing a book study about it, but they've imbibed these ideas. They're out there in the intellectual and cultural bloodstream, and that will determine what is politically possible down the line. It's a long-term project. It's not a short-term project. I'm not talking about saving the country, you know, in time for the next midterm elections. I'm talking about how do we, this is the soul of our country, and how do we think about the health of that? And that involves, I think, the people who are lucky enough to do kinds of things that we do for a living, which is engage with ideas. Like, how lucky are we to get to do that? Doing that well and not being sidetracked by the temptation to try to win, you know, short-term political victories by appealing to passions, when what actually we need to do is make sure we know what we believe in, why, and what is true and why is it true, and what does that mean for how we move forward as a movement. Mm-hmm.
So we've talked a lot about the texture of these arguments. There's something I kind of want to end on talking about the ethical component of this, because part of what we've been talking about, okay, what works, what doesn't work, what successfully drives social change, what doesn't. But there's also, I mean, what's most striking about some of this, I mean, when I was first in rooms, when I was hearing this kind of rhetoric, there was sort of a precognitive pang of conscience for me, when I was just sort of like, this just doesn't seem in keeping with sort of basic Christian morality and the sort of basic, you know, love God, love neighbor sort of thing. This just seems very discordant with a very basic understanding of Christian morality. And I always love those moments in life when I can feel uncomfortable, because that means it's like, oh man, my conscience is like doing its job. Like, a lot of times when I should feel uncomfortable, I don't feel as uncomfortable as I should. But in those moments in those rooms, I feel like in the pit of my stomach, sort of something. how do we deal with that sort of moral core that, that was the thing that got me reading, writing, and thinking about this, is because like I felt that, and I wanted to understand what that was, and I wanted to understand why other people weren't maybe feeling that like I was. It was very strange to be in a room with folks when some of this very incendiary rhetoric that sort of goes against the basic sort of biblical morality, or sort of just even disposition that folks should have in the world towards others. Like, how have you, because you've done a lot of reporting on this, and a lot of this stuff is not pleasant stuff to read or to listen to and the rest of it. How have you dealt with that, and what are your takeaways from that sort of moral dimension?
I had the experience that you're describing. The most acute experience for me was a few years ago. J.D. Vance was running for Senate. It was before he was even in the Senate, certainly before he was vice president. He gave an interview in which he described, he said that he trusts his voters because, quote, they hate the right people. And that hit me really hard because J.D. Vance, I think, is a smart man. He's a Catholic convert. He's a Christian. That's not, I felt it was like a Mack truck hitting me. Like, that is not an acceptable way to approach politics as a Christian. And I don't know whether Vance doesn't have the formation as a Christian to know that, or whether he was being politically cynical, right? Like saying what he needed to say in order to, what he thought he needed to say to win over the voters, to show them that he was on their side. But I wrote a piece that was when I first wrote my piece on against Game of Thrones Christianity, again, against treating politics as a game in which you win or you die, and against treating politics as essentially reducible to the friend-enemy distinction. I have people who are my friends, I have people who are my enemies, and the only point of politics is to make sure that my friends have power and use it against my enemies. That is not a Christian way to approach life or politics, right? Because obviously at the heart of Christianity is loving not just your neighbor, loving your enemy, right? Loving your enemy, not destroying your enemy, not seeking power in order to use it to punish your enemy. How do I love my enemy? How do I lay down my life for my friends? How do I self-emptying and self-sacrifice? These are so core to the Christian message. And I think that is very much lost in most of this sort of will to power, power-oriented friend-enemy, dissident right politics. So yeah, in a way, maybe what we're circling around is that until we do a better job of spiritual formation, our politics is not going to be. You can't fix the politics without fixing the spiritual problem first. If young Christians don't understand that this approach to politics is incompatible with the more important part of who they are as a follower of Christ, then trying to convince them to embrace a different kind of politics is kind of we're doing this in a backwards way. So I have been hoping. I think that one thing as social science actually suggests that we tend to think that there was a time 50 or 70 years ago when everybody in America went to church, and now we are increasingly secular and immoral and debauched, right? That's the narrative, is a sort of a linear decline in these things. But actually, the longer-term history of America, it shows that it's cyclical, that you have these moments of secularism, and then you have these great religious awakenings, right? And then it falls off, and then you have another religious awakening. I think we're overdue for a religious awakening, and actually that is probably a prerequisite for any of the political stuff to be fixed, is that we're going to have to remember what really matters, which is who we are called to be as people, as human beings with dignity created in the image of God. That we're going to have to solve that problem first.
Stephanie, thank you for reminding us what really matters in all your writings on this stuff. I think there are a lot of people who do a lot of great analysis of this, but I think you consistently bring out sort of the moral core, and I think that's really good. And you're always very charitable with your interlocutors.
I try,
and which is what you have to do. You can't argue for that moral core without at least making that effort.
Charity and humility. I'm not just saying that they're not being good Christians. We have to be good Christians ourselves, those who are Christians. And that means, treating the people on the other side, no matter how wrong I think they am, with a certain amount of charity and humility.
Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us on Acton Line.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.